Hey everybody, thank y'all so much for joining us online today. My name is Daniel and I'm the Worship and Creative Arts Pastor here at the church. Guys, we have One Church 101 coming up very soon, so if you'd like to sign up or get some more info on that, shoot us a message on whatever you're watching or send us an email at onechurchhartsville@gmail.com. Also, something very exciting that I can't tell you all about just yet, but if you're planning any type of vacations through October 16th through November 20th, you may want to keep your Sundays free because something exciting, and we're going to start a series based around that. So guys, you want to be there. So thank y'all so much for joining us online today. Hope y'all enjoy the rest of this video.
Church, we're going to declare this. We're going to declare it. Fling wide, heavenly gates. Let the King of Glory in. Let the King of Glory in. Come ride on your people's praise. Let the King of Glory in. Let the King of Glory in. It's time for the sleeper to wake. It's time for the old winds that change to change. I hear the Spirit say it's time. It's time for the dead man to rise. It's time for the great light to shine. I hear the Spirit say it's time. Swing wide. Go. Swing wide. Heavenly gates. Let the King of Glory in. Let the King of Glory in. Come ride on your people's praise. Let the King of Glory in. Let the King of Glory in. Fling wide, heavenly gates. Let the King of Glory in. Let the King of Glory in. Come ride on your people's praise. Let the King of Glory in. Let the King of Glory in. Sing. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Let the light in. Let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Let the light in. Sing it from your heart. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Let the light in. Let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let the light in. Open up the windows, let
What's up, everybody? Welcome to our Romans series. I'm really excited about this because we're going to begin to go through the most famous letter ever written. Now, if that bores you, think about this. It's only famous because it's changed the world. And if it can change the world, maybe it can change me. And that's the idea of this. And so we're going to go down and try to plant roots for our faith that will grow deeper maybe than ever before. So speaking of famous letters, there was a guy back in the 1970s who decided to write a story. Now, some of you have heard of this story. In fact, we're here decades later, and I bet all of you have heard of this story. His name is George Lucas. And $67 billion later, Star Wars has literally changed the world. There was a single mom in the early 90s that on a train ride home decided to write a letter that turned into a story. And now in 2022 and almost $40 billion later, I bet many of you know a story about a boy who would face a dragon, die, and come back to life. Well, it was a story written by J.K. Rowling. And our world's been changed by that story. There was a man in the early 60s that decided to write a story that would be a little different than anybody else. He said, we're going to have heroes, but our heroes are going to have struggles. His name is Stan Lee, and he created a story around a character called Spider-Man that would later transition into Marvel, that would later transition into Avengers. And we're here over $80 billion later, and our world has been changed literally by a story and by a letter that turned into that. And here's our thought for right now that I really want you to lean into, whether you're watching at home or in your car or at work. You should probably work, but if you got a break, it's okay. Wherever you're at, here's the idea. What if they didn't write those stories? What if George Lucas would have decided there are enough space movies and there are enough cowboy movies. I'm not writing a space cowboy movie or story, and we never had Star Wars. Here's what I want you to think. If we never had Star Wars, would you have missed Star Wars? And the answer is no, because you wouldn't even known what you missed out on. If there would have never been the series about the boy who slayed the dragon and faced death, would your children have missed that story? No, they just would have never known what could have been. If Stan Lee didn't follow through on his gut and write about heroes that had struggles, would our world have ever said, man, it's a shame that Stan Lee never got that started. I sure do wish we had more Marvel superhero movies, which nobody says because we got enough. But anyway, you know what I mean. No, because we would have never known what we missed out on. And here's the connection. Your life and my life are meant to write stories. And we're meant to make a difference. And we're called to step into a calling. And the world will never know what they miss from what could have been done through our lives. And we may never know. And here's the thing. One of the reasons that we're not motivated to go out and fulfill our calling is because we don't know what we've missed out on, because the story has never been written. And so the goal of today is to help you change that. For you to have a George Lucas moment that says, yes, we need a space cowboy movie that mashes it all together. For you to have a J.K. Rowling moment while you're riding on the train and saying, this story needs to begin to be written. Not written all the way, but begin to be written. For you to have a Stan Lee moment where instead of putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, you begin to write this new story that I really do believe can change your family, can change your community. If you and I and we, but let's just start with you, wherever you're at, would step into the mission and the calling that God has on your life. And don't make a mistake about it. God does have a calling and a purpose for your life. I don't care how much you've been in church or how much you've been out of church, how much you screwed it up, or how many years you've gone without writing the story, and maybe the guilt of not knowing what could have been has paralyzed you. Just start today. Start today and be interested enough at least to listen to what a guy named Paul says when he wrote a letter to the Romans about how we can find our calling and our purpose and our mission in our lives. So it's a series on Romans. So we're going to start in Romans chapter 1, and we're just going to read through and talk about it as we go. If you want to follow along, you can. This will be actually a good series to bring your Bible with, whether it's a digital Bible, whether you read it later tonight or some other time. But we're going Romans chapter 1. I think we'll just get through the first half of this chapter and we'll stop for today. Paul started this way. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle. That phrase is so key because Paul has actually never been to Rome. This is, I think, the only letter that Paul writes to people he's never met. And he's sort of given his credentials. And he says, I've been called to be an apostle. Now, what an apostle is someone who was an eyewitness to the risen Jesus. And Paul says, this is my calling. I don't know about y'all, but I think everybody would love to say, my calling in life is, hey, my name is Jimmy, and my calling in life is to preach and teach. I'm not even sure. I think it sort of is for right now, and I feel blessed that God has opened my eyes to that. But I talk to so many of you that you're like, I just don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what my calling is in life. And Paul has some confidence here, okay? And I want to say this too, that over the course of your lifetime, your calling may change. God may have a calling for one season and a different calling for another season. So don't feel like you're locked into the calling of 30 years ago, because God may be doing something fresh in your life. But if it's God that does it, wouldn't it be amazing, wherever you're at and whatever you're doing, wouldn't it be amazing if you could journal down or tell somebody, my name is blank, and I am convinced God has called me to go do this. That's exactly how Paul starts the most famous letter ever written. He goes on, an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, which means good news. The good news he promised beforehand through his prophets and the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son. And Paul's going to set his theme out. What I've been called to, all has its identity in Jesus. And whatever you're called to and whatever I'm called to will find its root in that word gospel, good news. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be called to be an apostle like Paul, or maybe a teacher like me, or maybe a musician and leader like Daniel, or whatever it is that other people you see. You're going to have your own unique calling that we're going to help you, I really do believe, help you today begin to decipher what that is. But Paul says it's rooted in Jesus. He goes on, who as to his earthly life was a descendant of David, and through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Through him, through the resurrected man, through the man who showed off the power of resurrection, we have received grace and apostleship. Paul would be the first person to tell you he didn't deserve the role. I will be the second person to tell you I don't deserve to be a teacher or a leader in church. It is by God's grace. It's a gift. And no matter what it is that God calls you to do, don't feel inadequate, because it's not about how great you are. It's about the grace of God in your life. And Paul says, I can stand boldly and say I'm an apostle, not because I'm awesome, but because God's given me grace, an undeserved gift through Jesus. It says, God, through his grace, has called me to apostleship, to call all Gentiles. And then he gets specific. And he starts getting more and more specific, which is a story of Paul's life. That early on, well, we won't go early. Once he became a follower of Jesus, I think he knew pretty early on he was going to be a teacher, and he was going to use his experience of seeing Jesus to help other people, apostle. But then as it went on, it became more and more clear who his target audience was, and his mission got even clearer. I will be an apostle to the non-Jewish people, even though Paul was a Jew. And God kept clarifying his mission and his purpose and his calling. That's what we want. So lean in. Come on, guys. No matter what you're doing, don't miss this. And so he says, to apostleship to the Gentiles. And And he goes on in verse 6. And you also are among the Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus. To all who are in Rome. By the way, Rome is the most powerful city on planet Earth at this time. It's New York City, but even more so. It's New York and Washington maybe combined is the way to think of it. It's the political center. It's the economic center. It's a symbolic center of the whole world because Rome almost ruled the whole known world this time. And Paul says to all of you in this very important place who are loved by God and called to his name, grace and peace to you. So Paul says the grace that gave me my calling is a grace that's available to you. This is not something that's just available to a few people. Grace does not have a limited supply. Grace is when God gives us things we don't deserve, and he's not running out of grace. So I don't care what your story is and how unused you feel like you've been so far in this story and how much you have not written a story that could change the world. God's grace is equally available to you right now. Not only to save you, but to show you your purpose and your mission in your life, whatever it is. And it may be helping, it may be serving, it may be visiting the sick, it may be building wheelchair ramps. It could be playing an instrument. It could be serving with kids. But God's grace is available to lead you into that equally because it's his grace, not my teaching, not your awesomeness, not my awesomeness. It's God's grace. He goes on. So grace and peace to you. And I'll say the same thing. I'm praying for God to give you something you don't necessarily deserve, which is a sense of purpose and calling in your life. And I'm asking God to do that for you right now, wherever you're watching, whatever's going on in your life. He goes on in verse 8. First, I thank God through Jesus Christ for all of you, Paul says to the Romans, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve in my spirit, is preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness of how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. I pray that now at last it will be God's will. It'll be open for me to come to you. So Paul says, you're influential. And that's true for everybody. When you think about your story, if it goes unwritten, two sad parts. One is it's sad for you because you do have a purpose and a mission you can step into by God's grace. But it's also sad because you are influential to the people around you. And if you don't write your story centered on the mission and purpose God has for you, that may be a mystery right now, then people around you are going to suffer. And it's one of those things that's weird because if the story's never written, you don't know what you're missing out on. And if your story's never written, actually the people around you never know what they're missing out on. So let's write the story. And he says to the Romans, you're so influential. To you, wherever you are today, with internet, with social media, with your family and friends, our connections spread so fast and so far. You have great influence. And I can say the same thing that Paul said to them, to you. I am praying for you. Like I know there are people in our community, they're praying for you. Even if we don't know your name, we're praying for hurting people, for people that are desperate for good news, for people that are desperate for purpose. And you have influence, and your story affects you and the people around you. He goes on, I long to see you so that I may impart a spiritual gift to you, and that is that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other. So your story is so important, but my story is so important. And what happens is God is the greatest author of all time. And he starts putting these stories together. And not only do they fit in the same big story, but actually when your story of purpose and meaning is being written, and when my story of stepping into purpose and meaning is being written, we actually make each other's stories better. And so I need whatever you're called to do, I need you to do that. Like I need you and you need me. That's the way God's designed the church, is that we need each other. And we need each other's gifts and talents and purpose and mission to be on display and be worked out. And we encourage each other. It's like I need the fruit off of your tree and you need the fruit off of my tree. And so Paul says, I really want to come to you so that I can encourage you and so you can bless me. And I'll be honest, he's actually talking about money there. And he's going to continue to talk about money. And he wants them to give because Paul has something that, well, a worthwhile mission for that money, to go and help people. Anyway, that's another day. He goes on, he says, I remember you at all times. I long to see you so that I can share my gift with you and you with me. The next verse, verse 13, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but he's been prevented in order that I might have a harvest among you. And he is talking about them giving actually financially there because they're wealthy, just as I've had among other Gentiles. I, Paul says, am obligated. It's a burden. I had this burden. And okay, to share maybe a little something to think about. Going through life without a mission and purpose is boring. But I do want to warn you that mission and purpose is a burden. Like it's a good burden. But it's the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night and wakes you up in the morning and says, I've got to do something about this. Whatever that this is for you. Paul says, I can't stand it. I know I've got to do everything in my power to help you. And it's a great thing. It's something I'm excited about. But I'm obligated, he says, to the Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That's why I'm so eager to preach. Wouldn't it be amazing if you could figure out what your calling is in life? And maybe your calling is to work with kids. And here's what you would say one day. I can't wait to go tell those kids about Jesus and love on them. I can't wait to get that hammer in hand and build that wheelchair ramp. I can't wait to go visit the sick. Who would have ever thought? Maybe a few years ago, I would have said, I tried to avoid doing anything other than hanging out in the lazy boy. But now God's motivated me and I can't wait to go. And Paul says, I can't wait to preach this to you because it is the power of God that brings salvation to those who believe, he says. And then we're going to stop on this last one. He says, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Okay. I've been talking a lot, and you're like, I still don't know what my purpose and mission is. Let's focus on that last phrase, and then we'll tie it together and give you something to do. Paul says, here's how this thing works, this life works. It's from faith, to faith, through faith. If you want to know what your purpose is, here's what Paul says. It starts with you taking what step of faith you can right now. You say that has nothing to do with it. Let me tell you a short story. About 10 or more than 10 years ago, I was a leader in a local church. But I really felt like, and I had a great job that I enjoyed, and I loved my family, and it was beginning, and I thought that was it. I thought that was the end of my calling, was maybe to be a deacon, maybe to be a Sunday school teacher, which would have been great. That's a great calling. But I really do believe that God called me to be a part of this team that started one church, and we've helped so many people. God's helped so many people through us. And I think back and I think, wouldn't it have been a shame if the story of one church had never been written? And when I think back on those moments, there's a moment in my life that I really believe opened the door to this. It was when I felt like God spoke to me in a weird way, not out loud, but just in my heart, and said, you need to be baptized. And that was a small but important step of faith in my life when I said yes to baptism. That measure of faith that said yes to baptism, I believed, opened the door to the next thing. And the measure of faith that God granted me through his grace opened the door and led to the next thing. And a measure of faith that God gave me that allowed me to say yes to the next thing, whether it was starting a kids program or whether it was speaking in church for the first time, the measure of faith he gave me to say yes to that led to the next thing. And I believe that led to one church. Now here's where I want to get this. If I would have said no to baptism, if I would have said no to the faith that I think God wanted me to display through baptism, God's in charge. He can do what he wants. But from where I can see it, the story of one church probably never would have got off the ground. And all this if one church has blessed you in any way, and this is just my part, it's not about me, but just my story, at least my involvement in one church, I think never would have happened. And so when I look back, what I can see is that it's a faith, it's a mission, it's a purpose, it's a story that's rooted in and started with a step of faith. God may not show you your entire mission and purpose today. It's usually not how he works. It's usually a step at a time. It's usually an open door at a time. But if you want to know your mission in life, here's what you need to do. You need to say yes to taking the step of faith that God's put in front of you right now. Well, you say, well, baptism has nothing to do with preaching and teaching and planting a church. You're right, except that it was a step of faith. And I want to challenge you who want to know your purpose in life to say yes to whatever it is, no matter how small or big it is that God's calling you to do. Maybe God's calling you to baptism. Well, maybe 5 years from now, you're going to figure out your purpose in life is to go and be a missionary to another country. And you're like, what does baptism in a YMCA pool have to do with going to Asia? Nothing, except faith leads to faith. And the journey we're on is a journey that starts and ends and is moved forward by faith. And if you say no to what God's calling you to do today, I don't know how this works, but it just seems like there's going to be a story that goes unwritten. And that affects your life, and that affects your sense of fulfillment and purpose and mission, and that affects the people around you. And it maybe even affects people on the other side of the world that you'll never meet and you'll never share the good news with. Maybe your step of faith today is putting your trust in Jesus. And if you continue to put your faith and say yes to what God has put in front of you, maybe that step of faith today is going to lead to the marriage that you always hoped you'd have, and to children that will be godly children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren you may never meet, whose lives may be blessed because of the story that was written through your family that started with you putting your faith in Jesus today. Maybe it's the faith of giving, like Paul goes on to talk about so much in Romans, because it's not about the money, it's about the faith. It's about saying yes to what God puts in front of us. And who knows what story may go unwritten if you continue to say no to what God's put on your heart. Maybe it's something entirely different. But I just want to challenge every person who says, I would love to know what my purpose in life is. I would love to know what my mission and calling is. Maybe God's going to call you to be a pastor or a teacher or a leader. I believe what God's just wanting you to do right now is to figure out what the small thing or big thing that he's put on your heart is, but you've been holding off on a little bit. Or maybe that he's just revealed to you in the last few moments. And would you just, with faith, say yes? That's what Paul did. And because Paul said yes to the unlimited love of God and the calling that he had on his life, because Paul said yes to that, Paul would step into the role of an apostle, somebody called to share the good news, the eyewitness good news of what he saw with Jesus. And because Paul continued to live by faith, imperfectly, but he continued to live by faith, God would narrow that focus down and say, now I want you to take this message to the non-Jewish people. And because Paul would say yes to that, the good news of Jesus would spread around the world. And I bet if you could trace your spiritual lineage back far enough, I bet you could connect it to a man named Paul, who says it's by faith, it's through faith, it's from faith to faith that God's purpose is revealed in our life. And if Paul would have never said yes and stepped out in faith, just the small things that God was calling him to do along the way, I bet we never get the book of Romans, which I believe is going to change all of our lives over the next few weeks. There's a step of faith that you need to take, and we can help you with it, whether it's baptism, maybe you're ready to put your faith in Jesus, maybe it's you take a step of faith financially, you want to give, maybe it's take a step of faith and have a conversation, maybe it's take a step of faith and serve, Whatever that is, please say yes to that. I'm begging you to say yes to that, not for us, not for any outside organization, just because, like the 10 years from now version of you will say, thank you so much, 2022 version of me that said yes to that. I never could have imagined where it's led to, because it's faith that leads to faith in God's mission and purpose in our life. And it starts there. I want to pray for you that you'll say yes to whatever it is God has put in front of you now. Father, reveal to us what it is you want us to do. And you're the one that gives us faith. So would you please give us the faith to say yes? And as we demonstrate that little bit of faith, will you grow our faith? And as you grow our faith, will you reveal our mission? And as you reveal our mission, will you give us the faith, because it's faith to faith, Father, will you give us the faith to step into it? Whether it's in Hartsville or the other side of the world, whether it's easy or the most challenging and adventurous thing we've ever done, show us our mission and purpose. Father, help every person listening right now to write their story that changes their world. And it starts with the first sentence. And the first sentence starts with faith. Help us to do that. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, we'll see you next week. Take that step. You never know where it might go. Have a good one.